Good morning, everybody. I'm Danielle Pletka. I'm the Vice President for Foreign and Defense Policy Studies here at the American Enterprise Institute, and I'm delighted to have two good friends, I think I can call you both good friends, join me this morning for a discussion of what's been going on in Libya, what's been going on in Egypt, and more broadly about the Middle East and where things are going. We laid this event on very quickly, and so I'm especially grateful to my colleagues for joining me and to you all here. Let me introduce you to Hisham Milham, who is the Bureau Chief of Al Arabiya here in Washington and a well-known expert on the issues we're going to be talking about today. Brian Katulis is a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress, fellow think tank here in Washington. And what we're going to do today is try and follow a slightly different format. You can see that we're sitting a little bit more talk show-like, and we're really going to try and have a conversation. I hope that we'll be able to involve you in that after we begin a little bit. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn to my colleagues and just ask them to talk a little bit about what's been going on. I think the news this morning is that demonstrations are continuing throughout the region. We have finally gotten an apology from the president of Egypt, although it was long in coming. There have been 4 arrests made in Libya, and there's also a little bit of a political furor going on in our country, as there always is in an election year when everything is political. So with that short introduction, I'm going to ask Brian to start us off and just talk a little bit about what you see going on and how really it impacts the bigger picture.
Great. Thank you, Danielle. And it's really great to be back here at AEI. You've hosted me at least a couple of times, and I've got to talk to my colleagues about returning the favor. We've always had really great exchanges, I think most recently in Tel Aviv last year. And Hisham, it's wonderful to be here. Your intellect and your spirit really is wonderful, and you help us understand a complex region of the world. What I wanted to do is make 3 sort of very brief points, truncate what I wanted to say, and then really we'll have a conversation here. I mean, first I wanted to offer a brief overview, a more clinical sort of strategic overview of where the region is right now, because I think we get caught up in episodes and we have a tactical, reactive crisis management type of debate sometimes, and we miss the strategy. Second, offer a couple of points on next steps for the U.S. in the Middle East, because I think we need to stay engaged as a leader in the Middle East. And then third, a little bit more in terms of even broader strategic challenges in implementing the sorts of things I suggest, and I'll try to do it in like 2 or 3 minutes, but it may run up to 5. First, where are we? We're in about 18 months, a little bit more, into a transition that quite likely will take years to go underway. And I've been sort of disinclined against these labels of Arab Spring or awakenings or things like this, because I think uprisings in some parts of the region are much more appropriate to try to be clinical here, because out of the 19 or 20 countries in the Middle East, depending on what you count, only 6 of them have seen substantial internal turmoil, and 4 of those have led to leadership changes in Egypt, Tunisia, Yemen, and Libya, quite obviously. So we're still very early on, and we can talk about the different categories of countries, because the vast majority have not seen major change, and I think sometimes we leave those to the side in the Gulf region. Second, I think this transition will go on for a long time because of the deep demographic, economic, political challenges. They're crushing. You look at the generation that's coming to power in this region of the world. If you think this week was difficult, expect more of this for the rest of this decade. We're in for a prolonged challenge here in the Middle East. Third, I think this change in the Middle East will further contribute to this complex multipolarity, competition for power within the region. And maybe Hisham and I can talk about this, but it's already started before the uprisings. The rise of Turkey economically and politically. Iran sort of up and down, more isolated these days, but quite complicated. And it belies sort of these broad labels of Shia versus Sunni, though there is some features of that. So main sort of assessment is that, my view, very early stages of this process. We need to buckle up. More of this is coming. And what do we do about this? I think first, despite the region in change, U.S. interests remain quite the same. Preserving the flow of energy resources out of the region, preventing major wars, particularly cross-border conflicts, countering terrorist forces in the region, stopping the spread of weapons of mass destruction. All of these responsibilities, we have men and women doing this every day, and we need to continue to stay engaged there. Given the complexity in the region, I understand the no one-size-fits-all approach. I'm not going to sort of apologize for it or things like this, but I understand sort of the pragmatic approach that's been adopted over the last 2 years or so. 3 things I think we need to do. Number one, I think we need to continue our investments in regional security, including a strong U.S. military footprint based on deterring these strategic threats. We shouldn't forget this sort of in the turmoil within sort of these countries. It's essential that the U.S. is the indisputed leader in the region. Nobody has the will or the capability to do what we can do in the Gulf region. China's not going to do it. Russia certainly is not going to do it. And we need to actually continually adapt that footprint. And for those who say, well, we should just retreat and things like this, I disagree with them. It's about how we use that power. Second, related to the first, but much more targeted, is we need to maintain vigilance on the counterterrorism front. I think the Libya events further underscore this a bit. But what we've seen in the last 3 or 4 years is a very aggressive counterterrorism campaign, not only in Pakistan, but in Yemen, in Somalia, and many other places. And again, worthy of a debate, controversial here in terms of drones and other things, but we need to do that. Third, last but not least, and I actually think this is the hardest for Americans, is we need to invest in other types of US leadership and power. We talk about smart power, but we actually need to actually invest some more in that. Y'all should take some time. I did this morning. I got up early, read some of these accounts of Ambassador Christopher Stevens and Sean Smith and the 2 former Navy SEALs, Tyrone Woods and Glenn Doherty. Take some time. I mean, I know we get caught up in our policy and politics, but read about their lives, especially Ambassador Stevens, and what a major source of power and influence, American power and influence, he was, in helping sort of figure out the politics, the economic dynamics, to disentangle Islamists who wanted to run in elections in Libya versus those who wanted to kill others. And we need more of that. And I stress that right now because I actually think that's where the real debate is, or should be, in this country. When I hear calls from Capitol Hill about cutting aid or cutting sort of the budget for the State Department and other things, that is a recipe, I think, for weakness and a withdrawal of leadership. That's the real, I think, debate that we need to have. Let me close here, because I have a lot I would like to say, but open it up to conversation. I think implementing this vision, or these ideas of what we need to do next, is, as everything else, easier said than done. I think, first of all, one of the big challenges we're going to face as a country, no matter who wins this election in November, is how do we implement this vision of rebalance that both President Obama and potentially President Romney talk about. There's a recognition that the geostrategic power game is shifting towards Asia. And there's not much of a dispute about those broad contours of we need to focus more on that. But me, as somebody who lived in the Middle East for 5 years, I focus on it, we need to stay engaged as a leader there. How do we execute that rebalance, militarily, economically, diplomatically, while also attending to the responsibilities and our leadership role in that part of the world? That's a very, I think, difficult challenge. Second, and we'll talk about this, how do we actually stay in the game when Islamists win elections and don't say the sorts of things that we'd like them to do? How do we actually smartly use the tools of our power diplomatically and economically? And I hope we get into Egypt, because I've been spending a lot of time in Egypt and working on it quite a lot. And then third, how do we actually, don't want to get too political here, but open to sort of questions and discussions, but our debate matters here at home about how we talk about this. And my biggest concern, again, isn't what I call the rhetorical debate about the rhetoric. What I worry about are the actual policy proposals that say, we should just cut out of this and we should stop investing in things like the State Department or the, aid to Egypt and things like this. I mean, we should think about how we calibrate it to create incentives and disincentives for the sorts of outcomes that we'd like. That's where the real debate is. But my worry is, and this is not a partisan statement because certainly it's Democrats and Republicans alike, people will just look at this complex region of the world and just throw their hands up and say, we can't do anything about this. And I understand that frustration, especially after we've gone into Libya and helped people, and then you see what happens this week. But we need to stick with it. But our political dialogue this week, and again, I get it, and I somewhat disagree with people who say this is not a time for politics. In a democracy, it's actually always a time for politics. The question is it good politics? Is it the sort of political thinking that elevates everyone else's thinking about what our leadership role is, what the challenges are? And I suspect just in the first couple of days, it's largely not been that. But hopefully this discussion and other discussions can sort of notch it up a level, because we're better than I think the debate we've had over the last couple of days about this.
Terrific, Brian. Thank you very much. I'm going to want to come back to a couple of themes. I'm going to turn things over to Hisham to talk a little bit about the region and what's been going on. And I know you're going to talk about Egypt as well, and about the specifics of this issue. But as a mnemonic to me, and you all can remind me, I do want to talk about aid.
Yes.
I want to talk about aid. I do want to talk about rebalancing. For me, rebalancing has come to mean retreat. And when I say retreat, I don't mean military retreat. I mean, we are turning our back on the region. We're not paying enough attention, especially to these changing countries in whatever we want to call it, the Arab awakening, the Arab Spring, whatever it is, these countries that are transforming before our eyes, and as you rightly say, will continue. A lot to talk about in American policy. But first, let's talk a little bit about the region, and let's talk the specifics about what we really think is going on. Is this really all about a 14-minute clip and the outrage of affronted Muslims who are drawn by this film that I haven't seen, and I suspect most of them haven't seen, to violence against the United States? How do you see it?
This is not about religion. This is about politics. This is about power. This is about empowerment, especially on the part of the various Islamist groups in the region. Now, let me say a few things in general. I agree fully, and I don't want to talk too much about U.S. policy, but I agree fully with Brian and with you that the United States, and actually in these crisis times, I always remember what Madeleine Albright said, that the United States is the indispensable power. And I would argue that today it is more indispensable than before. It is true that the people of the region are going to sort out these problems. It is also true that the transition, which just begun in terms of history, which is really nothing, few months or a year and a half, is going to take a long time. I'm always reminded of what, excuse me for quoting a Marxist at AEI, what Vladimir Lenin said once: sometimes decades pass and nothing happens, and sometimes in weeks, decades happen. We've seen that in Egypt in 18 days and other places, but I would argue, I would flip it up, that statement, and say that the transition is going to take years and probably decades. We are dealing with countries where politics, the way we know it, was wiped out for many years. In Egypt, I would argue that for 50, 60 years, civil society was suffocated, was assaulted by the state, and all of the groups that you would think would be our allies, the liberals, the Democrats with small d, with the reformers, or whatever, were crushed or neutralized, which left the political space for the Islamists, because you cannot assault the mosque. What is taking place now in all of these countries that went through the uprisings is a huge debate and conflict among the various Islamist, I mean, if you look at the Islamist spectrum, we have various groups. They start with the center, if you will, although I have my doubts about that, and they move to the right. And so the political debate about the form of governance that's going to take place in Libya or in Egypt or in Tunisia is taking place between Salafis, who are essentially atavistic reactionaries in the extreme, and the so-called mainstream Islamist movements, the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and Al-Nahda in Tunisia. Let me start with a caveat. I don't believe that these various Islamist groups can become democrats unless they really undergo a tremendous transformation. Most Islamist groups, I'm not talking about the Salafis, most Islamist groups who are considered in the West as mainstream have a serious problem with women, have a serious problem with minorities. And unless they settle this issue, we're going to have a huge problem dealing with them. Now, so these are the transformations and the debates that are taking place in the Arab world. Unfortunately, our people, or the Democrats with a small d and others, feel, in the case of Egypt, as being abandoned. If you go to Egypt, and talk to the students who began this transformation, right? They feel abandoned. Sometimes they level very legitimate critique of against the administration here, and sometimes it's not very necessarily legitimate, but essentially they say the United States for a long time shunned the MB, Muslim Brotherhood. They did not talk to them, boycotted them, ignored them, and now there's this full swing of the pendulum. They are ignoring us, and they are going to bed with them. Now, there's a lot of truth in this. But it would be a grave mistake if we alienate those reformers, the youth of the Arab world, the small businessmen, the people who studied in the United States and in Europe, the people who believe that it is in their own interest to have good relationship with the West in general. These people should not be alienated just because today al-Nahda is dominant in Tunisia or the Muslim Brotherhood is dominant in Egypt. This is a grave mistake. The other thing that's taking place, which again feeds into this sense of frustration and marginalization that many of these young men exhibit, is the fact that you don't have strong leadership in the Arab world, is the fact that you have, when you look at the game of states in the Middle East, what do you see? You see today a marginalized Egypt. And I would argue the marginalization began when Mubarak was there, okay? Mm-hmm. And Egypt, a country of 7,000-year history, 75 million people, was the bellwether of the Arab world in medieval times as well as in the last 150 years. Egypt today, that great power supposedly, could not influence events in Gaza when Mubarak was around. Egypt today cannot even control Sinai. And that is really, it's gnawing on the Egyptians. It bothers them a lot. Egypt today cannot compete with Turkey. Egypt today cannot compete with Iran. Egypt today chafes because Egypt believes it is living in the shadow of a powerful Israeli state. Now, if you look at Syria, the two regional powers who are competing to shape the immediate future of Syria are non-Arabs, the Turks and the Iranians. If you look at Iraq, the two regional powers that are trying to shape the immediate future of Iraq are not Arabs, or the United States for that matter. I would argue they are Iran and Turkey. So there is a weakness of leadership in the Arab world. States like Egypt, Syria, Iraq have been marginalized for one reason or another. Saudi Arabia, the decision-making process is very slow, and we have an old leadership there. Morocco is far away. The king doesn't want to get involved too much like his father in the affairs of the East. Algeria is still trying to sort out its bloody civil war in the 1990s. So you have a sense of malaise, you have a sense of weakness, of vulnerability, marginalization. And here comes the Islamists, who are absolutely excellent at exploiting this sense of marginalization on the part of the youth in particular. What is taking place is political, not religious, because the Islamists now are, the extreme Islamists are trying to whip up the frenzy of these alienated youth. Many of them are hooligans, soccer hooligans, and Salafists, and other, alienated, the types that Frantz Fanon used to refer to as the lumpen proletariat. These are people who are being exploited and used, and the sad reality is that today's Egypt under Mohammed Morsi, he is allowing this to take place to protect his flanks from attacks and criticism from the extreme Islamists and the Salafis, and allowing or encouraging the youth of Egypt to vent their ire and wrath against the American boogeyman, so that they will not focus on the injustices that are taking place in Egypt, on the incredible graft and corruption, on unemployment, problems with the minorities, Egypt, security in Sinai. Egypt has tremendous problems. I mean, yesterday I was so angry, I tweeted that hundreds of people die every day, hundreds, probably sometimes more than hundreds, in the thousands, in places like Syria, Yemen, Iraq, Somalia, Pakistan, and Afghanistan. I did not see recently somebody calling for a day of rage, quote unquote, to object to this Muslim on Muslim violence. But now you look at the map today, demonstrations in a number of countries, many of them are small, definitely, and many of them are egged and supported by the government, as in Iran. Even in Qatar, Even in Qatar today, a small group of people were demonstrating against the American embassy, shouting, Obama, Obama, we are all Osama. And that's what we have. But nobody is calling for a day of rage for those victims who are being killed in these countries. Yesterday, 5 Yemenis were killed. And people should ask, who is morally responsible for this? The president, I'll say this and end. I was appalled when I read the Facebook of Mohammed Mursi more than 24 hours after the storming of the American embassy in Cairo. It's a short statement. It starts by denouncing the so-called movie or video, and I probably didn't see, and consider it an assault on Islam. And it ends by saying, I asked my embassy in Washington to take legal action against the people who produced the movie. And in the middle, and I'm not exaggerating, it's in English now, he just in passing, he says, as a government, obviously, we are responsible for the protection of public and private property, including legations, foreign legations. No mention of the American embassy storming, no expression of sorrow, no expression of condemnation. And it was not only insensitive, it was appalling. This is a man who acts now as if he's still underground in the opposition and not the responsible leader of 75 million people dealing with a country like the United States, which is crucial. I would argue that the Obama administration, the way they supported the uprising, the way they called on Mubarak to leave 1 week, essentially after the major demonstration on January 25th of last year. And this is the country that stopped the military. I remember interviewing Mike Mullen, the former Joint Chiefs of Staff, and during those days, and he said to me, I was in constant contact with Sami Anan, my counterpart in Egypt. Don't use violence. And he said, and Gates up there was doing the same thing with Tantawi. And after the elections, if you remember, when there was some talk about the military undermining the elections, Hillary Clinton went on the record several times and saying we want the military to go back to the barracks and we want the process to take place. So in many ways, one could argue this man owes, in part, his position to the American position. And yet he was showing this kind of reaction. I think the United States should be clear on this issue. I definitely don't want to withdraw from the Middle East, but definitely we should focus on in the long run on the people that we should invest in, people in Egyptian society that deserve our support, while being very clear on this issue. Embassies cannot be stormed. The issue, this is not Islam. I hate to see an American official every time an idiot in the United States uses his camera or tell me he wants to burn a copy of the Quran, that this becomes an international issue that forces the President of the United States, the Secretary of State of the United States, to give you a lecture about Islam, or to give you a lecture about religion, and to give you a lecture about the American political system and how much it tolerates religion. This is not the issue. Every time we do that, they deal with this issue and say, we're talking about religion. We are not talking about religion. We're talking about raw power. We're talking about people exploiting the political atmosphere in those regions. And the people who are responsible are not only those who are storming the embassy, but the intellectuals who create the intellectual environment. I advise you, those of you who speak some Arabic, watch Egyptian television clips, and you can find them on YouTube, on the poisonous, venomous attacks that are taking place today against the Christian community in Egypt, against the West, which is brazen, full of incitement. These are the people who are responsible. The political leadership is responsible. The intellectuals, self-appointed intellectuals who are responsible, specifically those who are, the self-appointed custodians of the religion of Islam. And they have nothing to do with the religion, obviously. Most of them are hungry for political power.
Thanks very much, Hisham. I want to pull you back just to this quick question about playing on the religious turf, because I think we really haven't talked enough about this. I don't want to put you in a position, as a foreign correspondent of making recommendations to the American government. But I think that how we're perceived and how the statements that are made here are perceived is very important. So help me. What gets said when the ostensible reason for a storming of an embassy, even if we recognize that it's nothing other than a pretext, what should we be saying when the ostensible reason is some movie that defames the Prophet Muhammad? Should we just ignore it? What happens? What is going to send the right message?
I mean, I would expect that the ambassador in Cairo would say something that's fine. But the Secretary of State and the President to be engaged at this level, answering a producer of a movie or a so-called preacher in Egypt just because he's, whipping, the frenzy of the crowds, I think we will really lose sight of the real issue. Obviously, I would expect the President of the United States or the Secretary of State to be extremely careful. I remember when George Bush, and you know very well that the Bush family has a problem with the English language, used the word crusade when he meant the word campaign. Remember when he said, that's famous, yeah. Of course, when I translated this, I said, he said this is a campaign. Now, some correspondents here and there, on purpose, they translate it as a crusade in the old medieval times, which means you have a sword in one hand and the crucifix in the other. And when Bush used the phrase Islamofascism, that was not necessarily very smart because you don't need to dig up isms from Europe like fascism and Stalinism and superimpose it on the Muslim world. It's very simple to tell the Muslims and look them in the eye and say you probably have more than your share of nuts and crazies and radicals without using fascism. So you would expect the President of the United States to be careful and the Secretary of State, and I think they are. And but we should not allow ourselves to be dragged into a theological argument. It is not the job of the President of the United States to tell me that Judaism is a great religion, or Islam is a great religion, or Christianity. I mean, that's not their job. That's really not their job.
That's not why I voted for them.
And then you focus on the real issue. Americans have a problem with embassies. Since 1979, no country in the world had problems with embassies like the Americans. Yeah. From the storming of the embassy in Iran, to burning the embassy in Islamabad, to burning the other embassy in Libya. This was all in 1979. The killing of an ambassador in Lebanon, and then in Afghanistan, and then the list is long. So we are extremely sensitive about this, and everybody in the Middle East should know that we are extremely sensitive about this whole thing. I always think of this. I'm a secularist to the bones, and I have respect for all religion as long as you don't impose them on me and tell me to follow any of them. And I have a jaundiced view of turbaned men and bearded men engaging in politics. But I always wonder, when Muhammad Ali Aja tried to kill the Pope, did we see Muslim embassies being stormed anywhere in the world? Period.
Brian, I know you want to comment on that, and I want to engage a little bit on this question of U.S. policy, because I do think let's keep it to Egypt, although I think there's a lot to talk about in Libya as well. There's a feeling that we've lost our way a little bit. That we really that there wasn't that much support for the democratic uprisings in the region. We came to the question of Mubarak a little bit belatedly, and then we got dragged. I think that the perception in the White House especially is that we got dragged into Libya in an operation that we really weren't that enthusiastic about. And now, of course, we're keeping as far away as possible from what's going on in Syria, despite the fact that more than 20,000 people have died. There's a sense that for me at least, that what is being called the pivot in our world, the pivot from the Middle East to Asia, has actually just been a question of turning our back on these countries and sort of running on autopilot. And you're right, of course, that our ambassador in Libya was an extraordinary man, and I would say a very unusual one as well. But that doesn't mitigate the need for leadership in Washington. How do you see this?
Well, first, let me say one thing about what Hisham said about religion, and it's a very sort of volatile issue. I think the first statement of any leader or head of state in Egypt, other places, when there is violence, when there's laws broken, when people are murdered, is to focus on job number one, which is order and law and order. And it's astounding to me. I agree with we talked about this the other day, about President Morsi's statement there. That's job number one. And if you can't perform that job, you're going to lack legitimacy in the eyes of your own people in the long run. And the second thing I'd say, just in reaction, is I think the debate about sort of religion and sensitivities and things like this, we need to keep one point in mind, is that the radicals, the extremists, the fringe views in the region actually have a symbiotic relationship with the radicals and extremists in our own country. And that's what I consider these people. Again, I spent most of my time reading about the diplomats and the people who, I'm going to read a little bit later today about these people who produce this film, but I'm not as interested because they're not representative of our society, but there's this symbiotic relationship. And part of the game of these extremists is to take us off our game, to make sure that we don't keep our wits about us, that there is a strong desire for progress and change in the Middle East, and I've lived in many of these countries, travel there regularly. There's a strong desire among Americans, I think, to continue to support that. And I think we can debate sort of characterizations of leadership and things like this and how we apply these tools. But I think essentially we still are the indispensable leader. And let's hone in a little bit on Egypt, because I think it's the most strategic, most important challenge that we've got to figure out how to manage the change in Egypt. You're certainly correct in terms of Morsi came to power in part because of how this was managed. But it was also, Morsi came to power almost by accident, too. He was known as the spare tire. There was politics inside of Egypt that's quite vibrant. And when I go to Egypt, and I was there earlier this year, there was a strong desire, especially after the parliamentary elections, the early part of this year, and before the presidential elections, a strong desire for pluralism. And I would say even democracy at very basic levels. I got out of Cairo and talked to ordinary Egyptians, and it was seen in the first rounds of the presidential election, where the vote was split completely. Nobody got more than 20-25% of the vote. And there's a desire there for pluralism and figuring out, a way forward. And I think it's not yet reflected in their constitutional drafting process yet. All of these voices, Hamdin Sabahi and other candidates that got a significant percentage, are their voices included right now in this process? No. And to me, I'm sorry to drift away from the religion question, but I actually think this is where the centerpiece of the struggle is how do we actually use the tools of our power to make sure that we're not just simply doing the same thing that we did under Mubarak, that old model of decades of statecraft that was focused on a singular individual or a set of individuals. But how do we diversify the portfolio, if you will, and recognize, and this is going to be hard, for any sort of large bureaucracies to do, to produce statecraft, but we're starting to do that. You see this in terms of the economic support that's being offered, and I saw your 5 questions we should talk about because it's very smart. One of your questions is, are we going to cut off aid until in Egypt, until they actually restore law and order? And Morsi says the right things. I support the instinct. But as you know, and you worked on Capitol Hill, that button or that switch that cuts off everything that we're doing on security assistance, which the Israelis actually support and need for their own security, simply flipping that switch is easier said than done. And the biggest challenge, I think, beyond sort of the political and I would say ideological, because we often don't discuss the ideological challenges, but the biggest is sort of a different way of doing business in the Middle East that doesn't say this is our guy and these guys are going to implement our vision. It's dealing with a broad range of people who want to build a new society, and not thinking about, well, this is our leader like Salam Fayyad in the West Bank or other things, but that we need a systemic approach to help these societies develop democracies and economies that function, because the system's broken quite clearly.
Brian, I want to translate what you just said into the answer to the question I asked, which is, are we on autopilot? And I think the problem is too much we are. And one of the things that I see is, and I worked on Capitol Hill.
Yeah.
I had a lot of unpleasant arguments with people about aid to a whole variety of countries. I worked for a man who didn't support a lot of foreign aid. Yeah. And the problem is in the region that aid is viewed as an entitlement. We talked about this.
Yeah. Yeah.
And when something happens, when there's a fundamental change, we owe it. We're talking to an American audience here. These are tax dollars that are going to these countries. Yeah. Yes, of course, some of them absolutely imperative. They underpin the kind of law and order we're talking about. On the other hand, lots of them are about society and go through government and go through government NGOs and go through the military. And we are right to tie law and order, that we are right to tie rule of law, we are right to tie our values to the assistance we provide, and to at least be sure that there is a recognition that this isn't a check we write every year, willy-nilly, to, as you rightly say, our guy, the guy towards whom the pendulum swung this time, because that's exactly what we've done.
But let's unpack that, right,
Yeah.
on Egypt, because we're in violent agreement in terms of the strategic objective there. It's not about the strategic objective, but it's how you actually do this, okay? And you know, cash flow financing in Egypt for military assistance, this is one of the things that you talk to our senior commanders in the military who need partners in dealing with threats like what we see in Sinai, and Israel needs those partners as well. It is less complicated for them to use a cash flow financing system where the money comes a year in advance and other things. And then it gets tied up in defense contractors and other things. This sounds like tactical implementation, but it's essential to revise that system to say, okay, we're going to use this leverage right now, that we're not going to be tied endlessly to these ways of dispersing aid where we can't actually use it as a tool to produce change. So I don't think there's much dispute about sort of the broader strategic objective. I certainly don't have it. I think the bigger threat, going back to one point I said earlier, sort of in our political and policy debate, are voices like Rand Paul or others like this who are just saying, okay, let's hold back sending ambassadors to particular countries, or let's hold back certain types of assistance without really strategizing with an administration. And I hope, again, if there's a President Romney, that we have a much more functional policy debate about sort of how to do this as opposed to whether or not we try to use that as a strategy.
I don't think Rand Paul speaks for many in the Republican Party. I certainly hope he doesn't. I want to ask you a little bit more about this comment that you made about this feeling of abandonment, because I think that no matter how you characterize American foreign policy, and I know we would probably give different grades to the White House and the State Department on this, no matter how you characterize foreign policy, there is a sense, a perception of abandonment by the United States. And you hear this not just among the liberals and the small d Democrats. You hear this among the people who are fighting for their lives in Syria. You hear it in the Gulf, among the Gulf Emirates, who are desperate and fearful about Iran and about the influence of Iran in their countries, not just the nuclear weapon. So you hear a lot about the abandonment of the United States. How real do you think it is, and do you think that there's an antidote?
I mean, there are a lot of reasons and different reasons why people in the Gulf feel that the administration was not very strong on Iran. Of course, the Gulfies and the Israelis were unhappy with the way the Obama administration dealt with Mubarak, and they felt that he was dumped. I disagree with that, but that's another issue. In Syria is really the problem here. Today, Syria is in the throes of civil war. This was not inevitable. Although what was inevitable is that anybody who knows anything about the ethnic, religious mosaic in Syria would have told you that if a protracted conflict is allowed to continue and to fester, three things are inevitable. It will be more violent, it will be more sectarian, which will draw the jihadists and others, as we've seen in Iraq and Afghanistan. And the third thing is that it will spill over. All of these three things, unfortunately, happened. And I think there is a moral responsibility for the United States, for the EU, for the Turks, and the Arabs for allowing this thing to continue. And now everybody is just wringing their hands and talking about Syria, ending up like Iraq. The Syrians feel definitely abandoned by everybody. The Americans, the Europeans, the Turks, and the Arabs. And they now tell you, we know that we have to sort it out. Nobody cares. And I think there is a moral responsibility because the United States could have, at least in the first 6 months, when most of the demonstrations were peaceful, when violence were being exercised by one side, which is the government. It was brutal violence. And we've never seen it anywhere in these uprisings. I don't remember, with the exception probably of Saddam Hussein, using the Air Force to bomb the Kurds in the north. I don't remember in modern times an Arab autocrat using his Air Force to bomb his own capital, to bomb Aleppo. Mm-hmm. And for us, people who grew up in the Middle East, Arabs, you mentioned certain cities that have magical, impact on us. Damascus, Baghdad, Aleppo, and Cairo. These two great cities are being bombed by their own leader, And I think the United States, in the early months of the uprising, could have influenced the event and helped the right side, or encouraged others to provide weapons and others, if they don't want to do it for legal reasons or political reasons, or there are concerns that some of the stingers will end up in the wrong hands. I mean, you always run these risks. But in the end, if we're talking about the United States, the indispensable power, we may have lost an opportunity in Syria to influence the event, not only in Syria, but the entire Eastern Mediterranean. The other thing that baffled me is that the 5 countries around Syria are important for the United States. 2 of them are special, 3 actually with Iraq. Turkey is a NATO power. Israel, I don't have to tell you about their relationship. Iraq, we invested a lot, whether you like that war or not or whatever. And then you have Jordan and Lebanon, who are all traditional allies of the United States. And you would think that the strategic balance in the region, if the Syrian problem is allowed to fester, it will spill over. We've seen it in Lebanon and Iraq and even Turkey. Turkey is a modern, powerful country, and it's very concerned about what's happening in Syria. So you would think that all of these factors would push any administration in Washington to be more forceful in terms of supporting or maintaining American interest in these 5 countries, not only in Syria. And a change in Syria will reverberate from the borders of Central Asia to the Mediterranean.
But don't you both think that given what's happened in Egypt and
forget
in
about Syria
Libya,
now.
right? I think we can. Right.
I
agree with you.
Maybe for the short run, but I actually think in the medium to long run, something will need to be done beyond what's not been done right now in Syria. And I respect a lot of your views, agree with some, disagree with others. But I think the big point of hesitation in terms of what to do next, this look before you leap attitude, comes from the lessons learned right after 9/11 and Iraq. And when we went in without a very clear plan, we had grand visions, and some of which I supported. I went on the ground in Iraq, of other things, for this democratic tsunami was going to wash over the region. But then we found ourselves caught in the middle of a sectarian civil war while we were there with 150, 60,000 troops, people being displaced, an ethnic and sectarian civil war in the middle of Baghdad. We had troops there, and we weren't able to stop that. So I support your instinct. Going back to the question
you think we're using this? You think the administration is using this time that they're not intervening in Syria and letting people be murdered to develop a plan and a vision for Syria?
I think if you look carefully at what is being done in Turkey, and again, we can argue there should be more done, but what's being done quietly in terms of trying to build the framework for more support. You look at Robert Ford, who was a hero, who was maligned before he became the ambassador to Syria.
In Syria.
Yeah, our ambassador to Syria. He was maligned by many people, and his hearing was blocked. And I think his political efforts to bring coherence to the Syrian opposition, I think, is essential. All of the non-lethal assistance combined with what Gulf countries are doing. I see, I agree, Hisham, more can be done, Hisham. But the question is, what's the action plan and what's the plan afterwards? That was really what was missing when we went into Iraq and found ourselves. And we could talk about safe zones and other tactical tools, but the strategic sort of vision of how do you actually deal with a very complicated situation, not only from a security standpoint, a country that has chemical weapons right up against those countries that you talked about, Israel, Turkey, and I'm not using these as excuses. Just to say it's complicated, but even more complicated is this political, going back to one of the points I was saying, the political vision of how does this country reconstruct itself. Last thing I'd say on Syria, I think it's unfortunate, but no matter what the policy options are, you see how brutal this regime is and deadly. And even if we were to act militarily tomorrow, even if General Mattis had a plan off the shelf from somebody, I'm afraid that the brutality that you see, we're still going to see the numbers go up. We've seen 100,000 people killed in civil wars in the Middle East, in Algeria, in Iraq, in Lebanon, in recent memory. And I'd hate for that to happen here. And again, this is going back to the point I started with.
You'd hate for it to happen. It is happening.
It is happening. It is happening. But again, will the types of interventions that people propose actually accelerate the violence? And that's an analytical question. That's a very important question.
I want to pull us back. Just quickly, I want to open up to the audience, but I want to pull us back just to one question that I have, because I think I have 2 questions. But I'll try and make the first one quick.
You sound like a correspondent at the White House. Ask one question and end up with 2 or 3.
Exactly. And I know you two will indulge me, which the president never will. So top of Drudge last night, the story in the British press about how we had forewarning in Libya. I don't think any of us would have needed forewarning to know that Benghazi has been a hotbed of terrorist extremists, not just Islamists, but real al-Qaeda affiliated groups. And we also had a forewarning from Egyptian intelligence of what was happening in Cairo. Is this just a mistake? Is that the simplest answer? Governments do make mistakes.
Yeah, I don't know the detail. I saw the headlines,
Yeah.
so I don't know. There should be an investigation. I support sort of your question and all of that to make our diplomats safe. Again, going back to the point, I think we need these heroes on the front lines working there. I just don't know. Mistakes were made, as we saw sort of the day these uprisings, or this week the unrest started. The New York Times noted that there were multiple warnings about 9/11 that killed 3,000 people that were ignored by the Bush administration and not dealt with. And that's, to me, was a bigger strategic blunder. There are certain things that I think we need to learn
That's
from that
interesting.
situation.
That strikes me because, of course, all the same people who said that also said we shouldn't be arresting people in the street. We should be pursuing terrorists as criminals. I noted that the president first called in the FBI to deal with the Libya challenge as if it was a criminal matter. So, yeah, this is a big, much longer fight and not appropriate for this moment. My exit question before I throw it out to you guys is, what would have been wrong with the President of the United States coming into the Rose Garden and saying, I'm horrified by what has happened in Egypt and obviously horrified by what has been done in Libya. The safety and security of American citizens is my foremost responsibility. But I'd like to stand here and remind the people of Egypt and the president and the prime minister, acting prime minister of Libya, that American lives were laid on the line for you on the one side, and we supported your efforts on the other side. We stand with countries that stand with rule of law, and you need to understand that you need to do the same for us. Thank you very much. I'm going to be looking into this, and walk away, rather than all of this sort of excuse making about Islam. Would that have been wrong for the president to do that?
Well, actions speak louder than words, and
Going to arrest that guy in Florida.
Well, they're also sending our military, and you can denigrate the fact that we're sending our military. You can denigrate the fact that we're sending intelligence professionals who are there on the front lines, rooting out these extremists. But maybe we don't talk about that in our rhetoric.
Sure.
And also in terms of discussions with Morsi. And again, we're going back to sort of lessons learned about American leadership. What do you say in private conversations with leaders to get the outcomes that you need? And what do you say publicly to pontificate and make yourself feel good about American power? And there is where I disagree fundamentally, that I think sometimes hectoring and lecturing publicly, and the assumption there of your question, is somehow much more effective in terms of getting outcomes to make Americans safe.
Sometimes, but don't you think that what really made Morsi apologize was when the president was equivocal about whether Egypt was an ally, something that he actually didn't intend to say?
I actually don't know the timeline on all of that, but you need
delivered
to
a
use
real
all of these
message.
tools of public and private diplomacy is my point.
Now, I've been sucking up the microphone, and I'm sorry. Please do follow our rules and wait for the microphone and identify yourself and ask a question right up here in front.
Good morning, Jason Epstein, South 5 Strategies. Brian, question. Just following up on what Danny just said, would it have been so wrong for the president or someone high-ranking in the administration to at least float or say something on background to a reporter and question the issue of some of the foreign aid? And the reason why I ask this is, Danny, I respectfully disagree. I don't think Rand Paul is a lone voice, and increasingly, especially if the Republicans lose in November, I think there are going to be some very serious questions asked.
I meant that Rand Paul is an isolationist, and that I don't think most of the American people are isolationists. I think that he represents many views on aid that a lot of people share when they get angry. But I don't think the vast mass of the right and the right of center in America is isolationist. That's what I meant, Jason. But
it's a great question, actually, and would sort of a private public diplomacy approach floating this out there been more effective than whatever was said in the phone call between Morsi and Obama? I don't know, but I actually think, given my concerns about where Congress is and where we already have that tool in place, in a sense. There's not much appetite for a lot of this spending, and the billion-dollar debt relief and other things. I think, we've had 2 delegations in the last 3 weeks.
Billion-dollar debt relief of American debt to
yeah,
American aid to Egypt.
American aid to Egypt. Again, I actually think somehow our political system, as dysfunctional as it is already sending that signal, in a sense. And I tend to believe that there are more downsides towards all of that. But we really are, and going back to this issue of rebalance, it's not only towards Asia, it's the thrust that I think, whoever's president next year, this how do we invest in home, in our competitiveness? There's a strong strand in our politics that cuts across both lines. So, Jason, I think it's already out there in a sense. This package that we talked about for Egypt was announced a year and a half ago, and it wasn't solely bureaucracy or a lack of American leadership. It was a complex situation in Egypt, but it's also, I think, a very complicated debate that cuts across both parties on Capitol Hill about whether or not we're going to spend this. My point is, my view is this, like longer run, sort of medium to longer run, later this decade, that money's going down. I mean, it's not going to be the 1.5 billion or so. It's likely going to be something much more smaller. And I actually think we should consider aid to be a bridge to something that's much more functional rather than some sort of system of fostering dependencies that are dysfunctional. And I think this is where I think we all agree. And I actually think if we all put our minds together, we can use this downsizing in a sense smartly as opposed to just abruptly ripping it off, and stopping.
Very right here.
Thanks. Garrett Mitchell, and I write the Mitchell Report. Brian, it sounded like you were talking about something on the foreign policy front that's sort of like welfare to work. Which is an interesting concept. I want to make one observation, which is that you, Brian, in your earlier remarks talked about it's important how we talk about these things, and I just want to say that this morning, to me, is a classic example of how to talk about things, and I appreciate, I will say Danny has been doing, I think, a lot of this at AEI recently, and it makes a big difference, and I appreciate it. I want to try a slightly different take on this overall perspective, and that is to start with an observation that a French scholar made shortly after the so-called Arab Spring, in which he said that fear was the Berlin Wall in the Middle East. And I thought that was a pretty interesting observation about what was happening. The second part of that is that what he wasn't saying, and what I think we generally agreed on in this country, was what was happening in the Middle East was not something that was induced by or led by America, but was something that happened from the ground up in the Middle East itself. So, if you buy that point of view, that the Arab Spring, the Arab awakening, was not induced by America, why is it that today, as things seem to be falling apart in Egypt and Libya and elsewhere, why is it that we think that might be a direct function of America not doing enough or not doing the right things? Mm-hmm. If we weren't responsible for the awakening, why should we be responsible for this extension that both you and Hisham have talked about that's apt to go on for a long time?
Mm-hmm. Why don't you start out?
Look, I mean, this is a globalized world. Danny and I were talking before that when it comes to civil wars, and I did my share of studying civil wars, because I grew up in a country that had its own civil war. Most civil wars in the last 150 years, with the exception of the American Civil War, drew their neighbors into them. So, and that's why we knew if Syria continues like that, other players will come. I mean, Afghanistan was the case, Vietnam was the case, Angola, Lebanon, you name it. So, while I said earlier that this is something that the Arabs themselves have to sort out, how they are going to shape their future, outside forces may not be decisive, but outside forces can play a role Okay? I was telling Danny, reminding her that in Spain from 1936 to 1939, the whole European continent tore itself apart on Spanish soil, which was a prelude to the Second World War. So outside players have an important role. One reason Turkey today is doing well, one reason Turkey, and people don't talk about this, Turkey is doing well, is because of the pressure from the EU. Their desire to enter into the EU forced them to play by certain conditions that were imposed by the EU. No torture in jail, no political prisoners, no capital punishment, no this and no that. And they accepted them, and now they're, reaping the benefits. Nobody wants to admit that we did it under pressure. So the United States today has a role. The United States is not going to be decisive in shaping the future of Syria, but the United States can influence the march of the Syrian people at this stage. Not be decisive, but very influential. And that's the difference, and I think this is a legitimate debate we should have. I hear a lot, and let me remind everybody, I come from a leftist background. I mean, real leftist background, okay? You should see me in my youth, my long hair. But, living in the United States, I mellowed with, you mellow with years and you lose your hair too. When I hear Arabs and Europeans and everybody else chafe and complain about the United States, okay? And I ask them, okay, fine. Now we don't have a bipolar world. And if this world is going to be dominated by one political culture, okay? Would you rather that political culture be Putin's political culture, China's political culture, India's political culture, Iran's, Brazil, or the Europeans who cannot even defend themselves? And watch what they've done. The shame of Europe in the 1990s, when people were being killed for the first time since the Holocaust on European soil because of their ethnic and religious background, and Europeans went like this. The Clinton administration was forced to intervene, and in the end, they stopped the killing. And what did I see headlines in the Arab world? NATO's aggression against the sovereignty of Serbia. So, which political culture you want to be dominant? If this world is going to be dominant, the world will always be dominant by great powers, from the Roman Empire to the British Empire to the American Empire, and I use that term, loosely. So in that sense, the United States, is the indispensable power, and it's not a cliche, and it's not, but I think it is true. I want the United States to be the political dominant power in the Middle East, and not China, and not Russia, and not Iran. And I know the limits of the European. So in that sense, it's really a foregone conclusion that the United States, ipso facto, whether we like it or not, has to be involved in that region.
And did you want to add anything to that?
Just briefly, I think the ultimate burden for this struggle rests on the shoulders of the people in the region.
Sure.
For it to have legitimacy and credibility, it needs to be a battle, and it's going to be a complicated battle, going back to my first point, that will go on for a while. I think the U.S. can play a role if it uses all of the tools of its power, including diplomatic and political power, to move forward. I happen to believe that here we are, and this is, you'll disagree with this, and this is great, it's fine, that in 2012 we're in a much stronger position than we were, say, in 2006 in the Middle East, when we were stuck in a civil war in Iraq, when Iran was moving forward with its nuclear program, when our ally Israel was being attacked by Hezbollah, when Hamas won the elections in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. Is it that we're so much better now that bin Laden's dead and dozens of al-Qaeda operatives and we've gone on the offensive? Is it so much better that the region is sort of all functional? No, we're at the very beginning start of a process. And we can sort of tactically game or debate sort of even the partisan debate here at home. But I actually think if we keep focused on the strategy and the bigger issues of how do we actually continue to try to constrain Iran and prevent it from getting a nuclear weapon while not also building up the powers of GCC countries that are authoritarian and autocratic. All of this, and if you take one point away of this, it sounds muddled, but it is. We should rename it the Muddle East, not the Middle East. It's complicated, and the people of the region increasingly will have a say in setting their policies. I believe that that's the case. But the U.S. still needs to stay engaged as a leader, and leadership doesn't simply mean military intervention. It means a whole range of tools that people like our ambassador in Libya were trying to use. And I think we need to continue to stay in that game.
We're going to squeeze in one last question because we're running a little bit late. So this nice lady here.
Hi, my name is Asuka. I just have a quick question on the financial situation. I know it seems kind of,
Financial.
yeah, in terms of backing of these radical groups. For example, United States is in a hard economic condition ourselves, and right now the announcement for another quantitative easing, that's going to devastate our economy, if not entire, transatlantic economy. But
You got a question?
yes, I went to one of the hearing in the Senate on the HSBC. The banks involving in some of the financing of the radical groups in Saudi Arabia and other part of the world. And my question is, given Treasury also right now involved in letting funding to go to Free Syrian Army, $250 million for training militants in Turkey, and these things taking place. How do you stop this, and what do you see, United States involvement in terms of actually creating a condition where these things like what happened in Libya right now happens? And
thank you.
Do you think Glass-Steagall, something like that, would prevent that?
I think reenacting the Great Depression is probably a bad idea for us. But let me take your question, if I may, and just rephrase it and pose it a little bit. Yes, I think there's obviously a lot being done. I think that the bigger question is not so much the banks that are involved in terrorist financing, although that's really an issue for another day, but more, should our economic straits be dictating that we retreat, that we really... If I had to say there was one message that I hear from people like Rand Paul, it is we cannot afford to be involved in this, and so we should stop. What do you think of that?
Well, I disagree. I think the real central question is how do you match resources to meet threats? And we've got considerable resources, not just financial, but also moral and other things. And I think the thing I'd say to your question, the two sources of power, or instruments of power, that we've really seen a revolution in the last 10 years, and I think people get the first one I'm going to say here. The Special Operations Command and our military capabilities, particularly since the middle of last decade, it's really revolutionary when historians take a step back and say the targeted sorts of strikes, and it's not just about bin Laden, but the rise of Joint Special Operations Command, and again, we should probably debate this, but that was one tool of power that is sharper. It actually, almost every day, a president has the ability to call on them to deal with threats. The second is the one you're talking about. The Treasury sanctions, when you compare it to, say, like the 1990s, Serbia and other things, those tools, I'm deeply impressed, and you write about this on Iran, deeply impressed with what our Treasury officials have done with the private sector to hone those tools to try to siphon off those sources of financial support. Is it sort of game over? No, it's very much a work in progress. But again, thinking about power and in terms of what actually funds these sorts of militant groups, this will raise, I think, very difficult questions. We can talk about Gulf countries and countries like Saudi Arabia and private sources of support. We do on the edges of our debate about Afghanistan and Pakistan and who's funding these same people that are killing our soldiers. But having those tools of pinpointed cutting off money supplies, I think we've seen some dramatic improvements. Our country's stronger as a result of it, and we need to continue those investments.
With that, I'm going to thank, first and foremost, my two speakers here today, Brian and Hisham. Thank you for being here, and our audience. There's going to be a lot more to talk about, I'm afraid, not just in the coming days, but in the coming months and years. So thank you all very much. We are finished.
Thank you. Oh, yeah. Sure.
Thoughtful, eloquent, sophisticated,
Thank you.
simple, clear.